You kneel on cold stone that has outlived 3 kings and at least 1 plague. The chapel is empty, not quiet. Empty in the way a place feels after judgment has already happened and left the smell behind. Beeswax drips from a crooked candle. The flame stutters like it's nervous you might say something out loud. You don't. Your fingers slide beneath a loose floor tile near the altar. The stone shifts with a soft scrape that sounds louder than a confession. Beneath it, wrapped in wool gone stiff with age, sits a book that was never meant to survive. You already know what it is, because no one hides prayer books under the floor. You pull it free. Dust lifts in a slow gray breath. The leather cover is dark, cracked, and warm from centuries of hands that should have known better. No title, no saint, no cross, just a faint embossing of vines that twist into shapes your brain recognizes a second too late. Illustrations. Not holy ones. You open it anyway. The first page shows 2 figures, sketched in ink the color of dried blood. The lines are delicate, careful. Whoever drew this wasn't rushing. They were studying bodies the way monks usually studied scripture. Margin notes crawl along the edges in Latin, not the polished Latin of official church texts. This is practical Latin, the kind people use when they actually expect someone to follow instructions. Which is funny because this book is the exact thing the church spent centuries trying to burn, literally. In 1231, under Pope Gregory IX, the machinery of the Inquisition starts tightening across Europe. Its official job is heresy control. Its unofficial hobby is making sure nobody enjoys their body too much without permission. Turns out, pleasure without supervision is apparently a gateway drug to eternal damnation. You turn another page. More drawings, more notes. Positions mapped like battlefield formations. Arrows, timing. Even suggestions about when conception is most likely. Medieval people weren't ignorant about sex. They were obsessed with controlling it. Here's what matters. The medieval church didn't just care who you slept with. It cared how, when, why, and with what level of enthusiasm. Marriage was allowed. Reproduction was expected. Enjoyment was suspicious. By the 11th and 12th centuries, penitential manuals used by priests listed sexual acts the way modern apps list terms of service. If you did this, fast for 10 days. If you did that, congrats, enjoy 40 days of regret and bread. Some texts went further. They described forbidden acts in detail so priests would know what questions to ask during confession, which accidentally turned confession into the most awkward cue and a session in human history. You flip another page. This one is different. A woman is drawn alone, hair loose, hand resting on her own body in a way that is unmistakably intentional. The note beside her warns about solitary sin. The ink is darker, pressed harder into the page. Whoever wrote this wasn't just documenting behavior. They were terrified of it. Because pleasure you control yourself can't be taxed, arranged, or approved by anyone else. That's a power problem. By the 13th century, church doctrine across much of Western Europe insists sex must serve one purpose: reproduction, not bonding, not curiosity. Definitely not fun. Fun is how demons allegedly get invited in. You run your thumb across the page and feel the groove where the quill bit too deep. Someone argued about this while writing it. Someone lost. There's a reason books like this were hidden instead of destroyed. Even when outlawed, they kept being copied, quietly, patiently, like a secret that refuses to die. Monasteries condemned them. Scholars referenced them anyway. Nobles banned them. Nobles also commissioned illustrated versions. Hypocrisy isn't a bug in medieval society. It's the operating system. A faint sound echoes from the nave behind you. A footstep, or maybe wood settling. You freeze, because if someone catches you holding this, the punishment won't be a polite conversation. Depending on the century, possession of obscene or heretical material could mean public penance, imprisonment, or being made into an example. Medieval justice loved examples. Nothing motivates obedience like watching your neighbor regret existing. You close the book halfway. One loose page slips free, it's newer. Different ink, different hand. A note added decades later, translated loosely. It reads, "This knowledge is dangerous because it teaches joy without permission. You swallow. That's not a warning, that's a confession." Another sound behind you. Closer this time. And you suddenly realize the floor tile you moved isn't the only one that's loose. Who was allowed to desire, you slide the tile back into place, but your pulse doesn't follow instructions. The candle is burning lower now, wax pooling like pale fat across the stone. The chapel smells faintly of smoke and old wool. You keep the book tucked beneath your cloak, pressed against your ribs like a second, illegal heartbeat. Here's the part most people get wrong about the medieval world. It wasn't sexless, it was regulated hard. By the 12th century, church authorities across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were issuing detailed guidance about when married couples could have sex. Sundays? No. Holy days? Also no. Lent? Absolutely not. Advent? Try again later. Added up and nearly half the calendar was off limits. Romance, apparently, needed a scheduling app and divine approval. The logic was simple. Sex was tolerated only when aimed at producing children. Anything driven by desire alone risked sliding into sin. And sin wasn't just personal failure. It was believed to threaten the entire community. Bad harvest? Someone must be morally messy. Plague? Clearly somebody enjoyed themselves too much. Medieval problem solving had range. You step into the side corridor, boots whispering across worn stone. The walls are lined with faded frescoes of saints who look permanently disappointed in everyone. The book is heavier than it should be. Inside, several pages outline what later scholars would call penitential classifications. Lists of acts, assigned penances, timeframes for spiritual cleanup. It reads less like theology and more like a medieval compliance manual. Except the penalties include fasting, public shame, and occasionally being banned from communion for months. Sex wasn't just private behavior. It was public risk, because bodies were seen as weak points where the devil supposedly negotiated entry. You pause near a narrow window slit. Cold air spills in, smelling like wet earth and distant livestock. Another page. This one describes marital duty. It insists spouses must not refuse each other without valid reason. On paper, that sounds mutual. In practice, power leaned hard in one direction. Women were expected to obey. Men were expected to control. Both were expected to feel guilty either way. That's the medieval triple threat. Yet scattered between these rigid instructions are strange, almost sympathetic notes. Suggestions about timing for conception. Observations about pleasure, increasing the likelihood of pregnancy, which is ironic, because the official stance often condemned pleasure. So you get this bizarre contradiction. The same culture that warned against enjoying sex also quietly documented how enjoyment might improve fertility. It's like banning music, but publishing a guide. On the best acoustics, you turn a brittle page and find an illustration of a married couple in bed. Not explicit, but intimate enough that someone clearly studied real bodies instead of idealized saints. Their faces aren't sinful. They look calm. That might be the most dangerous image in the whole book, because calm suggests this isn't chaos or temptation. It's normal. By the late 13th century, several European regions had secular laws reinforcing church teaching. Adultery could mean fines, public humiliation, or worse depending on status. Same-sex relationships were criminalized in many territories, sometimes punished by execution. Desire outside the approved script wasn't just frowned upon, it was hunted. You hear voices somewhere down the hall. Low, conversational. You step back into shadow. Here's what matters. Regulation creates pressure. Pressure creates leaks. And medieval society was full of quiet leaks. Folk songs with double meanings. Bathhouse cultures that blurred moral lines. Pilgrimage routes where anonymity gave people temporary freedom from reputation. And of course, books like the one under your cloak. Manuals that mixed medical theory, ancient Roman texts, and practical observation. Some traced ideas back to works like the Kama Sutra, which had circulated through Arabic translations into parts of Europe by the Middle Ages that officially condemned, unofficially read. Because curiosity survives even when literacy doesn't, the voices grow louder. You slip the book open one more time, a margin note catches your eye. Different ink again. If pleasure is sin, why did God design nerves? You almost laugh. Dry, sharp, dangerous humor scratched into parchment by someone who definitely didn't say that out loud in public. Footsteps approach the corridor, and you realize the question in that margin isn't theological. It's rebellious. The scribe who drew too much. You move deeper into the monastery's archive room, where the air tastes like dust and mouse droppings. Shelves lean under the weight of chained manuscripts. Iron links loop through leather covers so knowledge can't wander off without permission. Medieval libraries didn't trust readers. Honestly, sometimes for good reason. You set the forbidden book on a narrow desk beneath a wavering candle. Up close, the inkwork is too precise to be amateur. The lines are confident, anatomical. Whoever made this knew bodies from observation, not imagination, which narrows the suspect list. Monks copied most manuscripts in Europe between the 9th and 13th centuries. Scriptoria were production lines of ink, patience, and back pain. Days spent hunched over vellum, recreating texts letter by letter so knowledge didn't vanish when the last copy rotted away. And sometimes, a scribe slipped something extra between the lines. Historians have found marginal doodles in real medieval manuscripts. Snails fighting knights. Rabbits executing hunters. Grotesque jokes in sacred books. People have always been people, even in robes. You turn to a section where the handwriting changes completely. The Latin is rougher, faster, notes squeezed between illustrations. One line mentions remedies for what it calls excessive heat of the body. Another suggests certain herbs to calm urges. Medical language, not purely moral, that points toward influence from texts like those by Galen or Avicenna, whose medical writings shaped medieval understanding of physiology. Back then, desire was often explained through humoral theory. Too much heat, too much blood, imbalance in bodily fluids. Basically, medieval biology said your bad decisions were a temperature problem. You flip the page. A small signature sits at the bottom, not a full name. Just an initial, M that's either bold or stupid. Because if church authorities discovered who produced an illustrated sex manual, punishment could include expulsion, imprisonment, or charges of heresy depending on content. You imagine the scribe, late at night, candle burning low. Official text finished hours ago. Instead of sleeping, he keeps drawing. Not out of lust necessarily. Curiosity, observation, maybe frustration with rules that didn't match reality. Or maybe he just got tired of pretending bodies didn't exist. Another illustration shows a couple with annotations about timing and rhythm intended to increase conception chances. Practical, almost clinical. This isn't pornography. It's instruction, which might be even more threatening because knowledge spreads. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council formalizes mandatory annual confession across Western Christendom. Suddenly, priests are expected to question parishioners about intimate behavior in detail. To ask, you first need vocabulary. Manuals like this quietly filled that gap, officially condemned, yet functionally useful. You hear a chair scrape somewhere behind the shelves, not close, but not far. Your eyes return to the page. There's a final note beneath the drawing. The ink is shaky, like the writer's hand wasn't steady. Knowledge is not sin. Silence is. That's not theology. That's defiance. You realize something uncomfortable. This book wasn't created just to describe forbidden's pleasure. It was created because someone believed ignorance was more dangerous than desire. The candle flickers violently as it drafts snakes through the room. Shadows stretch across the desk, turning the illustrations into moving shapes. For a second, it looks like the figures are breathing. You snap the book shut, because imagination is one thing. Getting caught with evidence is another. The footsteps stop outside the archive door, and the handle begins to turn. The bride who asked questions. You pull the book back under your cloak just as the door creaks open. A young novice steps inside, carrying a stack of plain parchment. He nods, barely interested, then moves to a far table. Either he didn't see the panic on your face, or he's mastered the medieval art of minding his own business. You slip out through the opposite archway into a narrower passage lit by a single slit of gray daylight. Your heart finally slows, and that's when you remember the folded page tucked near the back. You open the book again, careful, shielding it from view. The section isn't written like the others. The Latin is mixed with early Middle English, cruder spelling, personal tone. A story. It begins with a bride in a small English village sometime in the late 1300s, not long after the first wave of the Black Death had torn through the population. Labor was scarce. Social rules were tightening as authorities tried to restore order after chaos. Fear makes institutions cling harder. The bride's name is recorded as Ellen, according to the note. She asked her confessor a simple question before her wedding night. Not whether sex was allowed. That part was obvious. She asked whether she was permitted to enjoy it. That single question reportedly stalled the priest long enough that he consulted a superior, because medieval theology had an awkward relationship with female pleasure. Some scholars, like Albertus Magnus, argued mutual satisfaction helped conception. Others warned that too much enjoyment risked sinful intent. Imagine needing a committee to decide if you're allowed to have a good time with your spouse. Ellen didn't get a clear answer. So according to the text, an older midwife quietly lent her a small illustrated booklet. Not as detailed as the one you're holding, but similar in purpose. Guidance, reassurance, practical knowledge passed woman to woman outside official channels. That's how resistance often looked. Not rebellion with torches, whispers in kitchens, advice in bathhouses. Songs with meanings only locals understood. Cultural survival through quiet sharing. The story claims Ellen kept the booklet hidden inside a grain chest for years. After her third child, she allegedly returned it to the midwife with a note saying the knowledge spared her fear. That line is underlined twice, because fear was the church's primary enforcement tool. Fear of sin, fear of shame, fear of eternal consequences for very human instincts. You turn the page. There's a final annotation added decades later by another hand. It states that the midwife was later accused of spreading immoral teachings. No record of execution, but she was reportedly banned from practicing in the parish. Social death instead of physical, still effective. You lean against the cold wall, the stone pulling warmth from your spine. Here's the quiet truth threading through every page of this book. Regulation didn't erase desire. It just pushed knowledge into shadows where it became harder to control and easier to fear. And fear makes people easier to govern. A bell begins ringing somewhere above. Slow, heavy, calling for evening prayer. You close the book, but one last line at the bottom of the page catches your eye. If pleasure must be hidden, who benefits from the darkness? The bell keeps tolling. And for the first time, you wonder whether the people who outlawed these manuals were trying to protect souls or protect power. The rules written in ash. You follow the sound of the bell into a stairwell that spirals upward like a stone throat swallowing light. Each step is worn into a shallow dip from centuries of obedience. Feet climbing to prayer, knees climbing to penance. Nobody carved these stairs for comfort. You keep the book tight against your side. Here's what matters. Medieval authorities didn't rely on vague moral vibes. They wrote rules, specific ones, painfully specific. By the 13th and 14th centuries, penitential texts circulating across England and northern France listed sexual offenses with the precision of tax law. Adultery, contraception, positions considered unnatural, intimacy during forbidden calendar days. Each came with a spiritual price tag. Fast for 3 days. Fast for 40. Public. Confession. Denial of communion. Sin had a menu. You reach a narrow landing where soot stains the ceiling. The air smells faintly burned. Not from candles, not from something bigger. You open the book again and find a page that's been scorched along one edge. The parchment curls inward, blackened like it tried to survive a fire and barely made it. Because sometimes these manuals didn't just get banned, they got burned. In several European cities during waves of moral reform, bishops ordered the destruction of texts considered obscene or heretical. Public burnings weren't only about removing information. They were theater. A warning written in smoke. Knowledge goes up in flames. People remember the smell. You run your finger along the charred margin. Someone saved this copy before the fire. Finished its job. Which means someone risked punishment to keep it alive. That's not casual curiosity. That's quiet rebellion. Another page details what later scholars would connect to canon law shaped after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The Church tightened its grip on marriage as a sacrament. Sexual behavior became less of a private arrangement and more of an institutionally supervised contract. Once marriage is controlled, reproduction is controlled. Once reproduction is controlled, inheritance is controlled. Once inheritance is controlled, power stays where it's supposed to. Not exactly subtle. You turn to an illustration showing a couple separated by a line of text between them. The Latin describes intent. It warns that even within marriage, desire for pleasure alone risks moral corruption. Imagine being told your own spouse is a spiritual hazard if you enjoy them too much. Romance, but with surveillance. You let out a short breath that almost turns into a laugh. Medieval life really said, "Congratulations on getting married. Now please remain emotionally neutral." Another margin note appears in cramped script. If joy is dangerous, why is misery praised? That's not doctrine. That's someone getting tired. Footsteps echo from the stairwell below. Slow. Heavy. Not a novice this time. The rhythm suggests authority. Someone who expects doors to open when they approach. You close the book halfway. Here's the deeper layer. Public punishments for sexual misconduct weren't only about morality. They were about visibility. Stocks, shaming processions, forced confessions. Communities watched. Because shame works best with an audience. The fear wasn't just hell. It was neighbors. You tuck the book back under your cloak. The footsteps stop one level beneath you. And the smell of smoke suddenly feels a lot fresher than it should. The illustrations they couldn't erase. You slip into a storage chamber lined with old hymn boards and cracked wooden chests. It's darker here. Only a thin blade of light cuts through a slit window, turning dust into floating sparks. You set the book on a crate and open it to the center where the parchment feels thicker. This section is different. Full illustrations, more detailed than before. Ink layered with faint washes of color that somehow survived centuries of disapproval. Bodies drawn with attention, not shame. Whoever made these studied muscle, posture, expression. Not exaggerated. Not grotesque, real, which is exactly why they were dangerous. Because fantasy can be dismissed. Reality can't. You notice something else. Several figures wear clothing styles from different regions. One resembles southern France. Another looks influenced by Italian dress from the 14th century. This wasn't a single isolated creation. It was compiled. Pieces gathered from different places, different hands, different decades. A patchwork of knowledge that kept slipping through cracks in censorship. That's how banned material survives. It doesn't stay in one place long enough to die. One page includes notes referencing medical guidance about conception timing tied to lunar cycles. Medieval scholars often blended astronomy, medicine, and theology into one messy worldview. The moon influenced tides, so obviously it influenced bodies too. Science was improvisational. Still, the intention here isn't mystical spectacle. It's practical advice: when to try, how to reduce pain, how to increase comfort. Comfort, that word alone would have made certain clerics twitch. You lean closer to an illustration, showing a woman supported upright instead of lying flat. The margin text suggests it may reduce strain. There's no moral warning beside it. Just observation. This isn't lust propaganda. It's care. Which might explain why some midwives and lay healers reportedly preserved fragments of similar knowledge outside official church structures. Women often passed practical sexual and reproductive advice orally or through private notes, especially in communities where clergy oversight was strict, but daily life demanded realism. Authority writes rules, survival writes exceptions. A thin line of scraped parchment catches your eye. Someone tried to erase part of an image. You tilt the page. Beneath the abrasion, faint ink still shows through erased, but not gone. Because parchment remembers pressure even when pigment fades, you run your thumb over the rough patch and feel the ghost of the original line. Censorship in physical form. Remove the image. Leave the scar. From the corridor outside comes the murmur of two voices. One older, sharper, the other deferential. You freeze. The older voice mentions inspection. That word lands like a dropped blade. Inspections meant checking text for heresy, unauthorized editions, or anything that smelled morally suspicious. Monasteries were expected to keep intellectual houses clean. This room does not pass inspection. You flip one last page in the illustrated section. A small note sits alone at the bottom. They can burn pages, but they cannot unlearn what bodies remember. That's not sarcasm. That's strategy. The voices stop right outside the door, and the latch begins to lift. Confession as interrogation. You close the book and slide it beneath a loose plank inside the crate. Just as the door opens, two figures step in. A senior cleric in dark robes and a younger assistant carrying a ledger. They barely glance your way. Their attention goes straight to the shelves. Inventory mode. You keep your posture neutral. Invisible is the safest personality. Here's what matters. By the late medieval period, confession had evolved into one of the most powerful surveillance systems in Europe. After 1215, every Christian was expected to confess at least once a year. In practice, many were pressured into more frequent visits, and confession wasn't just about forgiveness. It was data collection. Priests used structured question lists drawn from manuals that categorized sins, including sexual ones, in meticulous detail. Questions could cover frequency, intent, context, even thoughts. Not just what you did, what you wanted to do. Privacy, medieval edition, basically meant whispering your secrets to someone with institutional backing. The older cleric runs a finger along the spines of chained manuscripts. He pauses at one, opens it, scans, closes it again. Routine. Efficient. Terrifying. Because if the wrong book appears in that process, consequences follow fast. You feel sweat gathering under your collar despite the cold. The assistant reads from the ledger, listing titles. Mostly theological works, sermons, saints' lives. Safe material. Approved narratives about approved behavior. Nothing about pleasure. Pleasure rarely gets its own chapter in official doctrine, unless it's being blamed for something. You keep your breathing steady. Confessional manuals from the 13th to 15th centuries sometimes described sexual acts in blunt terms so priests could identify sins accurately. Ironically, that meant clergy were often exposed to more explicit detail than the average peasant. The system condemned curiosity while quietly feeding it. Human nature doesn't disappear just because you give it robes. The cleric shuts another manuscript. With a soft thud. He asks if any unauthorized texts were found during the last review. The assistant hesitates. Your stomach tightens. Because hesitation is how investigations start. After a moment, the assistant shakes his head. No. The cleric nods, satisfied enough. They turn to leave. You don't move until their footsteps fade down the corridor. Only then do you crouch, lift the plank, and retrieve the book with hands that are slightly less steady than you'd like. Here's the psychological twist running through all of this. Systems built on moral control often require detailed knowledge of the behavior they condemn. To regulate desire, authorities had to study it, define it, categorize it. In doing so, they preserved the very information they feared. The book in your hands is proof. You open to a page near the back. A short passage describes confession as medicine for the soul. Standard language, safe. Then, in a different ink, someone added a single line beneath it. Medicine should heal, not frighten the patient into silence. That's not heresy. It's criticism. And criticism, in the wrong century, could cost more than comfort. A distant door slams somewhere in the monastery. You realize something cold. If inspections are happening tonight, this building is being searched more thoroughly than usual, and you're still holding the one book that absolutely cannot be found. The quiet network. You descend a side staircase rarely used, the steps gritty with years of neglect. The air grows warmer as you move away from the stone heart of the monastery towards storage rooms that once connected to kitchens and guest quarters. Places where rules blurred because daily life demanded flexibility. That's usually where secrets survive. You stop beside a narrow alcove and open the final cluster of pages. This section isn't instructional. It's a list. Names, initials, symbols, short notes about where copies were sent. No full locations, just hints. A river mark. A merchant's sign. A reference to a pilgrimage route leading toward Canterbury. A distribution network. Small, quiet, intentional. Because banned knowledge rarely travels alone. It moves through trust. Midwives, traveling scholars. Merchants who carry more than spices in their packs. Pilgrims who exchange stories along the road. Information hitchhiking across Europe, one conversation at a time. You trace one symbol shaped like a simple knot. Next to it, a note suggests safe hands. Safe didn't mean legal. It meant discreet. By the 14th and 15th centuries, literacy was still limited, but growing in towns. That created a strange tension. More people could read, yet more content was restricted. Curiosity expanded at the exact moment authority tried tightening the lid. Pressure builds, something always leaks. You turn the last intact page. An illustration shows no bodies this time. Just a closed book wrapped in cloth, placed inside what looks like a grain chest. A hiding place. Practical, common, invisible in plain sight. Exactly where Ellen's story said her booklet stayed for years. This isn't coincidence. It's confirmation that these manuals weren't isolated oddities. They were part of a quiet ecosystem of shared knowledge existing parallel to official doctrine. Two systems running at once. One public, one whispered. A final note sits at the bottom, written in the faintest ink yet. What is forbidden spreads fastest. You exhale slowly because that line isn't cynical. It's observational. From somewhere above, raised voices echo again. Sharper now, less routine. Someone is arguing. The word search carries clearly through the stone. So inspections just turned into something more serious. You close the book and look around the alcove. Old storage jars, broken baskets. A cracked wooden panel behind a stack of unused boards. A hiding place. Your fingers press against the panel. It shifts slightly. Loose. Of course it is. Because buildings that old are basically made of secrets. You slide the book into the gap behind the wood and ease the panel back into place. For a moment, nothing moves. No sound except your own breathing. Then footsteps thunder across the floor above you. Running. And you realize with a sudden sinking clarity, someone else in this monastery already knows the book exists. The night of questions, the running stops directly overhead, not a casual stop. The kind that happens when someone reaches the exact place they were aiming for. You stay perfectly still beside the loose panel, one hand still resting against the wood as if letting go might make noise. Above you, voices overlap. Sharp, urgent. One of them says the word manuscript, another says hidden. Your pulse spikes again. Here's what matters. When medieval authorities suspected forbidden texts were circulating, the response could escalate fast. Local bishops or abbots were responsible for maintaining doctrinal order inside their jurisdictions. If something heretical surfaced, they were expected to act before it spread. Containment was the priority, because ideas move faster than punishments. You ease away from the wall and step into deeper shadow behind a stack of old grain jars. The clay smells sour, like they once held something that spoiled and never fully left. Above. Boots scrape. Furniture shifts. A dull thud echoes through the beams. They're searching rooms now. Not routine inspection. Targeted. Your mind replays the list of names you saw, the symbols, the network. If even one person talked, or got caught with a copy, it would point investigators toward other locations. Interrogation didn't always start with torture. It started with questions asked calmly until answers slipped. Fear does most of the work for free. A memory surfaces from earlier pages in the book, confession as surveillance. Priests trained to probe gently, then precisely. The same skill set works outside the confessional too. You hear a new voice, older, controlled, the tone of someone used to obedience. He says knowledge of the flesh invites corruption of the soul. The line sounds rehearsed, probably delivered 100 times before. Here's the deeper truth. Institutions don't just ban information because it's offensive. They ban it when it threatens structure. These manuals didn't only describe pleasure, they shifted authority from clergy to individuals, from doctrine to experience. That's destabilizing. Because if people trust their own bodies, they might question other rules too. You press your back against cold stone and feel the damp seep through your clothes. Another thud overhead. Then silence. Heavy silence. The kind that means someone found something. Your throat tightens. But the next sound isn't triumph. It's frustration. A chair scrapes violently. Someone curses under their breath. Papers scatter. They didn't find the right book. At least not yet. You exhale slowly through your nose. Time stretches. No one moves above you for several seconds. Then footsteps begin again, spreading outward into different corridors. Search pattern widening. That's worse, because it means they're committed. You glance at the loose panel hiding the manuscript. For now, it's safe. But safe in a building currently being combed room by room isn't the same as safe. Another memory from the text surfaces. Public burnings as spectacle. Destruction not just to remove knowledge, but to warn anyone tempted to keep it. If they find this copy, it won't vanish quietly. It will disappear in front of witnesses. A faint draft slips through the alcove, carrying the smell of rain from outside. Night is settling over the monastery. Darkness will make searching harder. It will also make punishment easier to hide. You crouch and listen. From the corridor to your left, two figures approach. Their conversation is low, tense. One says the report mentioned illustrations. The other replies that images corrupt faster than words. You almost let out a dry, silent laugh. As if ink on parchment is more dangerous than the fear they're spreading through the building right now. They pass the alcove without looking. In. Close enough that you hear fabric brushing stone. Once their footsteps fade, you realize something unsettling. Whoever reported the book didn't just mention forbidden content. They mentioned illustrations specifically. That means the informant saw it. Recently. Your chest tightens, because you weren't the first person to find that loose floor tile. And whoever came before you is still somewhere inside these walls. What survives the fire? The monastery settles into uneasy quiet as night deepens. Searchers grow tired. Voices drop. Doors close with less force. Even authority has limits when the body demands sleep. You return to the hidden panel and ease it open just enough to retrieve the book again. The leather feels warmer than the air, as if it's holding the heat of every hand that kept it alive before yours. You sit on an overturned crate, candle stub flickering beside you. This is the last section. The final pages aren't illustrations or instructions. They're reflections. Short entries written across decades by different hands. Ink colors shift from dark brown to faded gray. Some lines confident, others shaky with age. One entry mentions a raid in a nearby town where several midwives lost their licenses for spreading indecent guidance. No executions, just removal. Reputation erased. Another references a scholar in northern Italy who argued that understanding the body honored God's design. The note ends abruptly, as if the writer thought better of finishing the thought on paper. Self-censorship in real time. You turn the page. A longer passage describes how certain teachings about mutual consent and comfort between spouses survived through oral tradition, even when written texts were destroyed. Advice passed quietly at wells, in kitchens during births. Knowledge without ink, harder to confiscate. That's the pattern running through everything you've seen. Burn a book, the memory stays. Silence a teacher, the lesson mutates and travels another route. Control can slow information. It rarely kills it. The candle sputters, nearly dying. Then steady is. One final page remains. At the top, a simple line. If this survives, it is because someone chose courage over comfort. Beneath it, several initials layered over each other across years. Not signatures for pride. More like quiet proof of custody. A chain of people who protected something they were told was dangerous. You run your thumb across the indentations. Each mark is pressure. A moment where someone decided risk was worth it. From outside, wind pushes against the old stone, making the walls hum softly. The monastery sounds less like a fortress now, and more like something tired. Ancient systems always look invincible until you notice how much effort it takes to keep them standing. Here's the haunting part. The church, the laws, the punishments, the burnings. All of it aimed at controlling desire, shaping behavior, preserving order. And for centuries, it worked well enough to define public life. But this book is still here. Hidden, handled, remembered, which means regulation never fully erased the human need to understand its own body. You close the cover gently. No dramatic snap. Just a quiet end. Footsteps echo faintly somewhere in the distance, but they're slow now, routine again. The urgency has drained out of the night. Maybe the search will resume tomorrow. Maybe the informant will try again. Maybe this copy will eventually be found and burned like others before it. Or maybe it will slip into another grain chest, another wall cavity, another pair of careful hands. You slide the manuscript back behind the loose panel and seal the wood into place. Darkness settles into the alcove as the candle finally gives up. Before the last glow disappears, one question from the margin circles back, sharper than before. If pleasure had to be outlawed to preserve power, how much of history was shaped not by what people did, but by what they were never allowed to admit they wanted?